December 16, 1944. On the outskirts of Bastogne, Major Ernst Huber of the Wehrmacht watched the skies with confidence. According to German calculations, the Americans were without air support. Cloudy weather would protect the offensive. Ground artillery? Inaccurate. The reports were reassuring. American shells exploded only on impact, and they almost always missed. Huber laughed. That laughter would be silenced minutes later by an explosion suspended in the air, 10 meters high. There was no contact. There was no delay. The shells exploded before touching the ground just over the troops, as if they calculated, as if they thought. That's the story of the radar proximity fuse, the most effective American secret weapon of World War II, a tube the size of a finger, equipped with a miniaturized radar capable of detecting distance and anticipating the exact point of detonation. Invisible, silent, lethal. He altered the course of battles, protected cities, and made the enemy doubt his own doctrine. This video reveals how a weapon unknown to the civilian public, rejected by German science, became the invisible divider between chaos and control. The viewer will not see tanks or planes. You'll see something far more powerful, a shell that knew when to die. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any argument. During World War II, the United States produced more than 22 million near-fused projectiles. Not only did they destroy 25,000 enemy aircraft, they also intercepted more than 5,000 flying bombs, protected entire convoys in the Pacific, and, according to British estimates, prevented the deaths of at least 20,000 civilians in London. A technology that the enemy has captured and discarded it, considering it impossible. In this video, we will reveal how America quietly created the most lethal weapon its enemies have ever understood. If you value the story told accurately and believe that invisible details can change the world, leave your like and subscribe. This helps the channel to continue unraveling the technical backstage that defined the fate of millions. In 1917, when the first anti-aircraft batteries attempted to hit German biplanes over the Western Front, it was estimated that it would take more than 8,500 rounds to shoot down a single aircraft. And this when the planes flew at less than 150 km/h, in predictable trajectories, at very low altitude. 20 years later, this mathematics of powerlessness has only worsened. By 1939, bombers were flying at altitudes in excess of 6,000 meters, exceeding 400 km/h, and arriving in close formation, in conditions that turned any anti-aircraft defense based on time or direct impact into an exercise in desperate guesswork. The fragility of the system was structural. The logic of anti-aircraft guns required the gunner to predict not only the direction and altitude of the plane, but also the exact time to program the fuse, so that the projectile would explode in the immediate vicinity of the target. An error of thousandths meant an innocuous explosion, miles beyond or below the enemy formation. And there was another invisible irony. The faster and more modern the enemy plane, the more useless the Allied artillery became. It was like trying to hit a moving needle blindfolded in the middle of a storm. And the Germans knew it. The Luftwaffe had this limitation. In 1940, during the Blitz over London, its pilots were flying confidently over the English capital, certain that the artillery on the ground was noisy but harmless. The statistics supported them. For every plane shot down by British flak, another 20 returned unharmed. It was a game of chances, and they seemed to play with the right cards. But there was something that even the American generals couldn't deny. They were losing more ammunition than they were buying time. During the first 2 years of the war, the United States fired more than 100 million anti-aircraft shells in training and combat, with tactical results close to zero. The traditional doctrine was bankrupt, and contrary to what many thought, it was not just a question of quantity, it was a matter of method. Modern warfare had advanced too fast for the mechanical precision of the clocks installed in the projectiles. Timed fuses, based on gears and springs, were 19th-century fruits fighting in a 20th-century conflict. In 1942, the fighting around Guadalcanal revealed the impending disaster. American ships fired incessantly at Japanese dive bombers, but hits were almost non-existent. On average, it took 2,500 rounds to bring down a single plane. It was the silent collapse of the defense. And the most serious, even when the hits occurred, they were accidental. The scorer did not win by aim, but by luck. It was in this context of desperation that American scientists began to propose something that, to the traditional mind, seemed absurd. Projectiles that thought on their own, weapons that did not depend on time, but on space. That they exploded not when the internal clock commanded, but when the enemy was really in range. It was too audacious an idea for conservative military circles, and absolutely unacceptable to Germans. After all, in the understanding of Nazi engineering, time control was the only possible variable within the bullet. No electronic tube would survive the force of a shot. No vacuum valve could withstand the 20,000 Gs of the launch. That was the doctrine, and it was fervently believed. But what the Nazi generals ignored was the scale of American production. By 1943, the United States had already doubled Germany's total munitions production, tripled in some segments. In terms of medium-caliber shells, the Americans produced 10 times as much as the Germans in certain critical months of the conflict. This difference was not just numerical, it was doctrinal. It was the result of a country that had transformed factories of radios, toys, and lamps into centers of technological warfare. What Germany saw as improvisation was actually an industrial network with elasticity and strategic intelligence. A force that didn't just manufacture more, it manufactured differently. If this statistic surprised you, write in the comments, "Logistics wins." The contrast between doctrinal faith and industrial flexibility was in the field, and the American artillery, useless as it seemed at the time, was about to undergo a silent mutation. A change that would not come from the strength of the cannons, but from the entry of something still unheard of on the battlefield, a radar the size of a lamp. And at the center of that revolution, a man named Merle Tuve was given an impossible mission. The first spark of this revolution did not arise in an American factory, but in a small British laboratory, surrounded by ruins and blackouts. In 1939, with London on the verge of large-scale bombing, the UK Air Ministry authorized studies on a type of fuse that could make the projectiles more effective, one that exploded close to the target and not just by impact or preset timing. The proposal was simple only in appearance: to create a projectile capable of sensing the presence of the enemy and acting on its own. The idea of embedding an active sensor inside a steel shell was considered visionary by some, fanciful by others. Technicians at the Admiralty Signal Establishment began the first sketches on paper, designing a small miniature radar that could theoretically measure the distance between the projectile and a nearby metallic object. The principle was solid, but execution impossible. British industry, battered by years of underinvestment and now suffocated by bombing, simply did not have the infrastructure to miniaturize components with sufficient precision. There was a lack of miniaturized tubes, insulators, and highly reliable welds. Above all, there was a lack of scale. The project was frozen. The paper was shelved, until a new kind of offensive began, not from the skies, but behind the diplomatic scenes. In September 1940, as the skies over London burned, scientist Henry Tizard embarked for the United States. In his suitcase, he had secrets: Informally called the mission that was worth more than a fleet, the TZ Group carried, among other top-secret documents, the plans of the magnetron cavity radar, the studies of the nuclear reactor, and the sketches of what would later be known as the proximity fuse. The proximity fuse. The gesture was more than technical. It was an act of partial surrender to American industrial superiority. The United Kingdom recognized that it had the ideas, but not the capacity. By delivering the plans, he also delivered the hope that the Americans would do the impossible. The response was swift. In just weeks, American scientists from the NDRC, National Defense Research Committee, isolated the Proximity Fuse project and placed it under the direct responsibility of the Carnegie Institution in Washington. The lead went to physicist Merle Tuve, an expert in high-precision and radio frequency measurements. He didn't start from scratch. He had in his hands the British theory, the endorsement of the American government, and above all, an industry that knew no limits. While Germany centralized its decisions in ideological circles and England struggled to keep the lights on, the United States opened its universities, laboratories, and factories for an unprecedented experiment, turning theoretical science into an assembly line. The first irony of the war was beginning to take shape. The country that least believed it was about to enter the world conflict. The United States was still officially neutral, was the only one with the technical and material capacity to manufacture the weapon that would change the course of the war. This transfer of strategic faith from the British to the Americans is one of the most symbolic episodes of World War II. Tizard, when handing over the documents, reportedly said, "We are giving you the crown jewels." But what the Americans returned a few months later was an even more precious artifact, the promise of an intelligent, automated, autonomous defense. A projectile that not only saw the enemy, but acted without human command. The first practical test of the concept would come shortly after, with a device that was still unstable, heavy, and with a reduced range, but it exploded. In the air, close to the target. A partial but real success. What the British dreamed of under rubble, the Americans began to sketch in metal, and so, as the Luftwaffe celebrated its advantage in the skies and German doctrine mocked the lack of discipline of democratic innovation systems, the greatest irony took hold. The most advanced weapon of warfare was not created by a regime of order and hierarchy. It was created by civilian scientists in open research centers with public funding and intellectual freedom. The first smart projectile in history was not born in a bunker. It was born between notes, calculations, and a pact of trust between nations. But for this theory to become a tool of war, it was still necessary to overcome the greatest challenge of all, transforming fragility into resistance, and that would require getting into the most sensitive part of the project, the electronic heart of the weapon, a tube that no one believed could survive a shot. A tube that, if it worked, would detonate the era of smart munitions. Merle Tuve was not in the military, wore no uniform, and would never command a battalion. But he was one of the most dangerous men in the war. Housed in a modest building at the Carnegie Institution in Washington, D.C., Tuve led a select group of physicists, engineers, chemists, and mathematicians gathered under a goal as simple as it was impossible: to build a radar the size of a thimble, capable of surviving the firing of a cannon. The goal was clear: an electronic fuse that would detect targets and explode the projectile in the air at the exact moment of approach. But between theory and practice, there was a technical abyss that few dared to look at head-on. The first difficulty was physical. When a projectile is fired from a 127mm anti-aircraft gun, it undergoes an acceleration of more than 20,000 times the force of gravity, a violence that would crush any electronic circuit, destroy any conventional tube. Scientists needed to reinvent the very fundamentals of component engineering. It was necessary to create vacuum tubes smaller than any ever made, with microscopic supports that could resist vibration, heat, and impact. Tuve's lab has turned into a center for extreme testing. Small devices were fired by test guns just to see which ones would survive intact. With each experiment, new failures. The pipes broke, the welds were bursting, the radar oscillated, and even when the components resisted, sensitivity was another obstacle. The sensor needed to differentiate an airplane from a ray of sunlight, a real target of an electrical noise. The fight was against nature and against time. The project, officially classified as VT Fuse, Variable Time Fuse, involved dozens of laboratories in absolute secrecy, but the hard core, the point of scientific convergence, was under Tuve's direct command, and he knew he needed non-standard minds. Among those recruited were figures such as James Van Allen, who years later would go down in history as the discoverer of the Earth's radiation belts. Another name was William Higginbotham, who would work on the Manhattan Project and later create the first video game. But there, at that stage, everyone had only one focus: to make the explosion think. The main technical problem was in the balance between robustness and sensitivity. The circuit had to emit radio signals, measure the return time, calculate the distance, all in microseconds, and still detonate the explosive at the right moment. An error of 0.01 seconds meant a deviation of tens of meters. In combat, it was the same as missing completely. The tests continued into the night. One early morning in December 1941, a prototype finally survived the firing and detonated in flight. It was not a total success, but it was the first time that the concept ceased to be just a hope. Tuve, exhausted, reportedly cried silently in his office upon seeing the data. The next morning, he personally wrote a memorandum. It is possible. It requires refinement, but it is possible. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, German military science remained tied to the weight of hierarchy. Goering despised any weapon that had no immediate impact. German physicists, stuck to the classical model of direct application, disregarded as delirium any attempt at electronic miniaturization for ballistic purposes. A Luftwaffe report called the idea of deploying radars on projectiles absurd. It wasn't just skepticism, it was institutional blindness. Germany, with all its technical apparatus, had neither the decentralized structure nor the cultural elasticity to allow a project like VT Fuses. In the United States, on the other hand, universities, factories, and research centers worked in synchrony. The government did not impose the model, it funded and left scientists free to create. And it was this freedom, this invisible network of civil-military cooperation that allowed engineers to go beyond theoretical limits. In a few months, the prototypes began to be subjected to batteries of tests with complex variables, changes in temperature, humidity, acceleration, magnetic noise. The standard of demand was brutal. Each new model had to withstand at least 98% of simulated battle conditions. A single deviation in blasting time was enough to abort an entire production line. The pace was frenetic. In April 1942, the first batch of 5,000 experimental fuses was produced and delivered for field trials. The results varied, but the margins of error began to narrow. In June, the success rate already exceeded 60%. In August, it exceeded 80%. And then the numbers started to haunt. In controlled simulations, a projectile equipped with a proximity fuse was 5 times more likely to hit an aircraft than any other known method. Scientists knew they were facing a new weapon, not in explosive power, but in intelligence of use. It didn't matter the caliber. The calculation mattered. The Germans, for their part, remained stuck with the doctrine of brute force. Their fuse design still relied on mechanical systems, springs, gears. The concept of a radar embarked on a bullet was so inconceivable that it didn't even enter the high command debates. The difference between the two worlds began to be measured in real time and in lives saved. In September 1942, the US Navy authorized the first experimental use of the proximity fuse in actual combat. The stage would be the Pacific, the target, the Japanese bombers, and the result, as it would soon be seen, would give rise to a new doctrine, one where the bullet not only killed, but decided the right moment to do so. James Van Allen looked into a glass tube smaller than a finger and saw an entire battlefield compressed inside. In front of him, dozens of prototypes rested on the bench of the Johns Hopkins University laboratory, each with a small defect, a millimeter flaw, a circuit broken by the violence of the shot. He knew the future of artillery no longer depended on gunpowder, steel, or armor. It depended on controlled fragility. The real obstacle between theory and combat was the vacuum tube. This tiny component, essential for any electronic system of the time, was also the most sensitive point of the project. Originally developed for radios and hearing aids, the conventional tube had not been designed to withstand impacts of thousands of Gs. But that was exactly what the new projectile required: survival under absurd conditions. Van Allen, with his clinical eye and his physique patience, began to test unprecedented configurations. Instead of trying to reinforce the tube, he redesigned it. He created internal supports with flexible and light metal alloys, replaced fragile materials with absorbent compounds, and, in a moment of almost absurd intuition, applied the principle of the mousetrap spring, an internal system of tension that counteracted the impact of the shot. The tube, previously passive, now responded to violence. Miniaturization, once an obstacle, has become a weapon. The new tubes, produced by hand in small series, began to withstand firing tests. The circuit oscillated but did not break. The emission of radio waves was brief but effective. Inside the projectile, a spiral antenna emitted high-frequency pulses. When these pulses returned, reflected by any nearby object, the circuit mediated the phase change and fired the explosive charge. The detonation window was milliseconds. The precision unprecedented. What the Germans called fantasy, the Americans now called a production series. The irony of this story is that the solution was before them, not in arsenals, but in household appliances. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content about the technological backstage of the war. In September 1942, the Navy authorized the first actual combat trials. The fuses were fitted to 5-inch anti-aircraft shells aboard the USS Helena. The target, Japanese planes diving. When the firing began, the difference was visible and audible. Explosions no longer occurred on the ground or at random. It took place in the air, directly next to the targets. A single salvo shot down 3 planes. On a second attempt, a plane fell apart before it even completed the dive turn. It was as if the ammunition itself could see. The psychological impact on the scorers was immediate. For the first time, they felt they could react with control. The technical impact was even greater. In just 2 months, the anti-aircraft success rate of the fleet, equipped with proximity fuses, had quadrupled. The cost per downed plane had fallen by more than 70%. The projectile had ceased to be a saturation tool and had become a precision weapon. Reports began to circulate quietly between departments. The expression VT fuse came to mean not only a technical success, but the beginning of a new doctrine. For the first time, detonation was decided by sensors, not humans. For the first time, time was not programmed. It was calculated in real time. Germany, still based on mechanical systems, did not even imagine that it was already losing a war that it did not even know had started. A year later, in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese would launch one of the largest air offensives against an American naval force. What occurred that day would later be called the Great Turkey Shooting, a cruel expression to describe the slaughter that would result from the massive use of the proximity fuse in action. But before that, the new weapon had to survive one last challenge: to be produced at scale. Because inventing was just the beginning. Now, it was industry that would have to do the impossible: manufacture millions of exploding brains that they thought before they killed. When the first prototypes of the proximity fuse finally worked in the field, the next challenge seemed even greater: how to turn such a delicate, almost artisanal invention into an industrial mass production. The American response came not from military arsenals, but from what made the United States unique in wartime: the ability to turn a civilian nation into a total combat cog. The project was handed over to the Navy's Special Division, which called on companies such as Crossley Corporation, Sylvania, Raytheon, and dozens of civilian manufacturers that, until a few years earlier, had produced home radios, Christmas lights, and hearing aids. Overnight, consumer factories began assembling war devices with surgical precision. Vacuum tubes, coils, antennas, and high-sensitivity explosives were now integrated by trained workers under regimes of absolute silence. More than 80,000 workers, mostly women, were trained to produce the electronic components with margins of error of less than a hair's breadth. The pace was frenetic. In 1944, the United States produced, on average, 70,000 proximity fuses per day. Each unit underwent electrical testing, vibration simulations, moisture sealing checks, and microscope assembly inspection. A single error could invalidate the entire batch, and even then, the combat failure rate was less than 3%. It was not only a technical feat, but a logistical feat. The American model did not depend on a single factory, nor on a single genius. It was a distributed production network, with standardization engineering, decentralized quality control, and full integration between science, industry, and combat. Meanwhile, in Germany, the reality was different. The Nazi war effort, while technologically ambitious, was fragmented by internal disputes, administrative redundancies, and the constant fear of espionage. Several parallel initiatives competed for resources, with no real coordination. Electronic weapons programs were directly interfered with by political leaders, and priority was given to what had an immediate impact: rockets, heavy tanks, bombs. In 1943, the Germans were still arguing over which department would have the authority to standardize the use of portable radios. The Americans that same year were already embarking thousands of smart projectiles in the Pacific. The irony was visible. The regime that preached absolute order was incapable of creating a functional system of scientific cooperation. American industrial democracy, with its trade unions, civil unions, and free universities, showed a practical cohesion that the German war machine never achieved. The results soon spoke for themselves. The American ammunition inventory in 1944 indicated that more than 22% of medium-caliber anti-aircraft shells were equipped with proximity fuses. In some naval engagements, this number exceeded 50%. The US Navy already considered the fuse no longer an innovation, but a standard of doctrine. And the most surprising thing, most operators did not even know the inner workings of the weapon. It was enough to charge, shoot, and watch the skies open in flames. The confidence was total. A technology that had been born under suspicion was now routine operational. A projectile, a calculation, an explosion suspended in the air. The nightmare of enemy air formations. And the Germans? In a field report intercepted after the surrender of a Luftwaffe unit, one officer describes the Allied use of anti-aircraft artillery as a kind of sudden magic, which hit us even outside the predictable trajectory. He concluded, "Our calculations were right, but they saw us before." What this officer didn't know is that the Americans did, in fact, see it. Each projectile was a small radar on a suicide mission. And the industrial production of millions of these units marked the beginning of an era where intelligence was released by the thousands, explosive and silent. But the impact of this revolution was not limited to ships or factories. In the camp, the soldiers still did not know what was coming. The real test would come when this technology came out of the sea and was used for the first time over land. About soldiers, about advanced training, and in the frozen forest of the Ardennes, this decision would change everything. On January 5, 1943, the light cruiser USS Helena patrolled the restless waters off Guadalcanal. The heavy sky and the tension on the radios indicated what was coming, a Japanese air attack. The American gunners, accustomed to the feeling of helplessness, were preparing once again for the usual theater, shooting without seeing the effect, hoping for luck, counting those who survived. But that night, something was different. The 5-inch shells, now coming out of the Helena's turrets, carried a secret. Embedded in them was a small radar, a sensor that would calculate the exact moment to explode on its own. The gunners knew only that they were testing something new. What they did not know was that they were witnessing the beginning of a new era. As the dive bombers approached in formation, the first salvos climbed as usual, but the difference was brutal. There was no waiting. There was no impact on the ground. The explosions happened in the air, in the middle of the trajectories, at precise altitudes. A Japanese plane disintegrated before reaching the bombing line. Another exploded in a fireball after a detonation that seemed to anticipate its turn. A third crashed without even being seen from the rear. The bridge's radio began to broadcast short sentences, interspersed with incredulity. "It's working! They're falling! Sir, I've never seen that." Within minutes, the attack was repelled with an efficiency never recorded. The crew, initially skeptical, now looked at the empty shells as if they contained some kind of mystical intelligence. The most repeated comment that night came not from an officer, but from an anonymous gunner. "It's like God is inside the shells." For the first time, the men operating the cannons felt they had control. They no longer shot in hope. They shot in effect. The change was psychological, tactical, and doctrinal. The Navy's reports confirmed it. The rate of downing had increased by more than 300%. And most impressively, ammunition expenditures had fallen by half. A projectile with a proximity fuse cost more than a regular one, but it eliminated the need for dozens of blind shots. In high command meetings, the decision was unanimous. The new technology would be expanded to the entire fleet. In 1943, the USS Helena became ground zero for the greatest doctrinal change of American naval warfare. From there, the ships would not only react, they would anticipate. The skies, which once belonged to diving bombers, were now infested with invisible sensors, waiting to explode with atomic clock precision. And the great irony, the Japanese never knew what had hit them. Their reports attributed the failure to new high-rate artillery, without imagining that it wasn't the quantity that destroyed them. It was the calculation, the intelligence embedded in the ammunition. The USS Helena would survive that attack, but would crash months later in July, victim of Japanese torpedoes. However, his contribution had been fulfilled. She wasn't just a battleship. It was a floating laboratory that proved that science, when coupled with industry and operational courage, could alter the fundamentals of warfare. After his mission, requests for proximity fuses skyrocketed. The admirals demanded more. And soon, a new question would arise in the strategy rooms. What if this same technology could be used not only against airplanes, but against soldiers? In the brutal arithmetic of war, every victory costs tons of steel, gallons of fuel, and human lives. But in 1943, the United States began to alter that equation, not by increasing volume, but by multiplying efficiency. The data doesn't lie. Before the introduction of proximity fuses, shooting down a single aircraft required, on average, between 500 and 2,000 anti-aircraft shells. It was a saturation math. Shoot until you hit. After the systematic adoption of the new technology, this number dropped to 125. In certain units, it reached 120. Accuracy turned into savings, fewer shots, less gunwear, less fatigue in the garrisons, less need for refueling. In a conflict where logistics decided the pace of the front, this quiet advantage was devastating. Every salvo now counted. Each shot had tactical weight. While the Americans fired less and hit more, the Luftwaffe did the opposite. It tried to make up for mounting losses with ever-increasing effort. The Germans even doubled the production of anti-aircraft ammunition between 1942 and 1944, but the results plummeted. With each plane shot down, more resources were drained. A German Air Force report of December 1944 admitted that the efficiency of anti-aircraft batteries had fallen by 68% since 1941. The reasons cited were generic: climate, altitude, pilot evasion. The real cause, the existence of an autonomous detonation weapon, was not even mentioned. Pause. Here is a brutal fact. In 1944 alone, the United States produced more near-fused projectiles than Germany manufactured of all its anti-aircraft ammunition combined. If this surprises you, comment below. Shocking data. Because this was the war that few have seen, the war of calculations, of sensors, of the invisible production that shaped the battlefield. In the Pacific, the difference was even clearer. When the American fleet faced massive kamikaze attacks, VT shells became the main defense. A plane diving at 600 km/h was hit by an explosion 6 meters from the fuselage. No direct impact was required. It was necessary to think faster, and the projectile did it on its own. Officials began to report cases in which a single shot destroyed 2 planes due to the explosion in close formation. It was no longer a question of winning by number, but by the intelligence embedded in the shot. General Henry H. Arnold, commander of the U.S. Air Force, declared that the proximity fuse was as decisive as radar and the atomic bomb, a claim that rarely appears in school textbooks, but which was evident to anyone who read the efficiency charts. The doctrine has changed. Artillery is no longer defensive and has become strategic. Enemy planes needed to fly higher, which reduced their accuracy. Some simply gave up the attack when they detected the presence of ships equipped with the new fuses. The gun didn't just kill, it deterred. And Germany, with its belief in grandiose solutions, super heavy tanks, experimental rockets, giant cannons, did not realize that it was losing the war by centimeters, the distance between the target and the explosion. 1 centimeter calculated electronically, with silence, with logic, with miniaturization. But the inevitable question became increasingly audible in the Allied command: whether a shell could think in the air. What would happen if he thought about the soil? In 1944, Wehrmacht units stationed in France intercepted a shipment of unexploded American shells following an artillery bombardment near Normandy. Among the devices captured, one of them had partial damage. It had exploded out of schedule, expelled part of its casing, and left the fuse compartment exposed. The German engineers, when they opened the device, found something they could not decode. Instead of springs, pins, and mechanical timers, as they had hoped, they found themselves with a complete electronic circuit. Tiny vacuum tubes, internal antennas, microcomponents welded with millimeter precision. The initial reaction was disbelief. A technical report prepared by Luftwaffe experts concluded that the artifact was clearly an attempt at Allied disinformation and classified the tubes as scenographic, designed to confuse. The idea that such components could withstand the acceleration of a shot was for them physically impossible. In the logic of traditional German engineering, still stuck to the standards of the First World War, An electronic tube was synonymous with fragility. The electronic miniaturization that the Americans had achieved simply did not fit the Reich's doctrinal paradigms. The data was sent to Berlin, but the High Command dismissed the threat. Göring, in an informal memo, reportedly said, if they needed these fantasies to win, they would already be lost. The phrase would become a symbolic epitaph of the doctrinal blindness that had settled in the technological heart of the Third Reich. While the Americans bet on decentralized labs, extreme testing, and accelerated iteration, the Germans still demanded that any project go through ideological committees, political evaluations, and ministers' signatures. Rigidity, which in times of peace had guaranteed technical excellence, in times of war became a fetter. The Nazis, even in possession of the gun, did not believe her. It was as if a blind man touched a microscope and concluded that it was just glass and metal. In contrast, the British, who had started the proximity fuse theory but lacked industrial capability, knew exactly what they had missed. An internal MI6 document, dated November 1944, read, "It is possible that the Germans captured a VT fuse. They are unlikely to understand its importance." This assessment, loaded with irony, showed a cruel truth. American superiority was not only in the weapon, but in the mentality that made it possible. Scientific freedom, trust in engineers, acceptance of error as part of progress, all of this had enabled the US to build a weapon that the enemy could not even understand, even with it in hand. The German defeat at that point was not just military, it was epistemic. The knowledge was before them, but they did not have the key to recognize it, and while they ignored it, the shells continued to fall. In 1945, the US Army began applying proximity fuses in land battles. For the first time, soldiers would be targeted by explosive intelligence, and the psychological effect would be as devastating as the physical one, because now even the artillery seemed to know where the enemy was. In June 1944, as Allied forces advanced on Normandy, a new threat loomed in the skies over London, small, fast, and pilotless. They were the V-1s, the so-called flying bombs, launched by Nazi Germany as a retaliatory weapon. The strategy was clear: spread terror, destroy civil morale, and force the British to retreat psychologically. Every morning, the low-pitched sound of pulsating engines cut through the dark sky, followed by a dry silence, and then an explosion. Panic returned to the streets. The British Parliament demanded answers, and the Royal Air Force, despite being mobilized, could not contain the increasing volume of attacks. The V-1s flew at medium altitudes and constant speed, but their numbers and the difficulty of interception required something beyond traditional methods. It was in this scenario that American artillery came into action with a resource hitherto unheard of on European soil: projectiles equipped with proximity fuses. Positioned around London, the cannons began to use the new devices with immediate results. Instead of trying to hit the bombs directly, something almost impossible, the sensors calculated the distance and detonated the projectile in the air, next to the target, exponentially multiplying the chance of destruction. The city, until then hostage to luck, now has an invisible shield. In just a few weeks, more than 5,000 V-1 bombs were destroyed in the air. The number of impacts in densely populated areas has dropped dramatically. A British report from September 1944 stated, "Without the VT fuses, we estimate that London would have suffered at least 20,000 additional deaths." It wasn't just a military victory. It was a civilian salvation. The sound of explosions has become less frequent. Sirens sounded, but increasingly accompanied by reports of successful interception. In a letter sent to his mother, a soldier from the American anti-aircraft unit wrote, "Today we shot down 10. The city applauded." For the first time, the population felt that someone could protect them from the sky, and that someone was a gun that thought before it exploded. The irony was inevitable. Hitler dropped his flying bombs as a symbol of technological superiority. And it was precisely these bombs that revealed the doctrinal backwardness of his science. While Germany bet on propaganda machines with wings, the Americans used applied science, mass production, and embedded mathematics. The result was clear: a city saved not by promises, but by precision. Churchill, in a private speech to Parliament, thanked our allies who have brought not only strength but light. In free translation, the light of the miniature radars that now exploded above the rooftops of London. For Germany, the impact was invisible but deadly. The V-1s consumed precious industrial resources. Its production required steel, engines, fuel, and time. Every bomb destroyed in the air meant hours lost in underground factories, wasted human effort, eroded political morale. The German generals expected London to bleed, and they found an invisible barrier built by scientists and operated by civilians armed with mathematics. But this was not the last field where the proximity fuse redefined the logic of war. Because while London was breathing, a new kind of battle was taking shape in the forests of Belgium, and there the psychological impact of this technology would reach its climax. December 1944. The dense forests of the Ardennes became the scene of the last major German offensive on the Western Front. They called it Wacht am Rhein, Vigil on the Rhine, but for Americans it would go down in history as the Battle of the Bulge. The German plan was bold: a surprise attack in the midst of the harshest winter of the war, relying on blizzards to keep Allied aviation on the ground. And it worked. For days the sky was closed. The fighters and bombers were stuck to the runways. The Allied soldiers, isolated, surrounded, and without air support, faced the relentless advance of veteran armored divisions, supported by tens of thousands of men. It was, according to the logic of the war, the perfect scenario for a German victory. But what came next contradicts all tactical prediction. The offensive, initially devastating, began to slow down. German losses were increasing sharply. The advancing formations were decimated by artillery that seemed to see through the fog. It was no longer necessary to wait for the enemies to get close. The projectiles began to explode above the trees, in the middle of the columns, even before the first rifle shot. It was as if the sky, even without planes, had returned to fight. For the first time, proximity fuses were authorized for land use. It was a calculated risk. The secret of the technology still needed to be preserved, but the situation was critical enough to justify the release. The 406th Artillery Brigade received the first batches, followed by the units protecting Bastogne and St. Vith. The effect was immediate. Enderby-Feindlimiter shells now exploded a few feet from the ground, forming a cone of falling fragmentation, hitting soldiers in shallow trenches, breaking through cover, scattering shrapnel like horizontal rain. A single shot was enough to break entire formations, and most importantly, there was no visible pattern. To the German soldiers, the American shots seemed magical. They knew where we were even without seeing us, an officer of the 116th Panzer Division would write in a confiscated diary. The enemy's perception was not one of confrontation. It was of invisible persecution. Nazi intelligence reports attempted to explain the new efficiency with theories about chemical munitions, sound-guided artillery, even tactical espionage. None of them even considered the real answer, a small radar embedded in each shell that calculated the exact moment of the explosion based on the distance from the ground or the moving body. It was as if the projectile observed the field before it died. And he died with surgical precision. The American doctrine of indirect fire was transformed. It was no longer necessary to wait for the impact. The new rule was anticipation, and this cost the enemy dearly. It is estimated that in the first week of the Battle of the Bulge alone, more than 17,000 German soldiers were wounded or killed by artillery equipped with proximity fuses. a number that exceeded the losses inflicted by aviation in the previous month. German morale, already weakened by the wear and tear of the Soviet encirclement in the east, began to collapse in the west as well. A prisoner captured near Houffalize confessed, "We believed you knew where each of us was." It wasn't just gunpowder, it was the perception of omniscience. The Germans, stuck with the idea that total control required communication and direct aiming, could not understand how the Americans, surrounded, without reliable radio and without aerial reconnaissance, could still react with such precision. The answer was in the shells, not the positions. In each shell dropped by the American batteries, there was a small calculation, an equation that exploded at just the right moment. The Ardennes winter, which was supposed to be the German swan song, became a white graveyard watered by invisible shrapnel. General Patton, as he passed through Bastogne, summed it up dryly. "The weather prevented us from flying, but our bullets flew past us." And as the snow melted, revealing the trail of hanging craters, the enemy began to understand, too late, that he had lost not only the offensive, but also the advantage of thought. Because, while they were still trying to win with more tanks, more men, more strength, the Americans won with a projectile that thought for itself. And in Japan, on the other side of the world, imperial intelligence was beginning to receive reports about the German collapse. They knew that if something unseen had defeated the Reich, perhaps nothing could stop the next advance in the Pacific. Inside a 127mm artillery shell, something extraordinary was happening, not after firing, but during flight. There, enveloped in steel and gunpowder, pulsated a system of simplified thought, a primitive electronic intelligence that would revolutionize the battlefield. The proximity fuse operated on a simple but devastating principle. It emitted micro-frequency radio waves, usually in the range of 180 to 220 megahertz, that were launched in all directions from a small spiral antenna. These waves collided with any solid object in their path, whether it was airplane wings, armor, structures, or human bodies. By detecting the return of the reflected waves, the circuit calculated the distance to the target. When that distance reached a programmed threshold, usually between 5 and 15 meters, the fuse would trip the main charge before impact. The result was an anticipated cone of destruction, impossible to predict by the classical doctrines of war. It was the end of the binary logic of direct impact. The projectile now exploded, not when it hit, but when it was deadliest to explode. Inside that capsule there was more than metal. There was time, space, and decision. The heart of this technology was the miniaturized vacuum tube, a valve the size of a fingernail, designed to extreme specifications. It needed to withstand shocks of up to 20,000 times the force of gravity and operate stably under sudden variations in temperature and vibration. All this in milliseconds. The system worked like a radar, embedded in a ballistic trajectory. There was no remote control. There was no external communication. It was totally autonomous. The projectile thought, mediated, decided, and killed on its own. To make this possible, each piece was assembled with almost surgical precision. The capacitors, for example, needed to maintain their charge even after the violent firing. The internal batteries were only activated by the firing itself, using kinetic energy to start the circuit. The sensor was calibrated to ignore static noise, wind, and debris. It responded only to the pure reflection of solid mass in approach. It was, therefore, selective. It was, therefore, more effective than many human eyes. By 1944, Americans were producing 40,000 of these devices a day. By 1945, that number would jump to 70,000, while Germany, in the same period, was still struggling to standardize its conventional ammunition. Pause. This difference in scale defines the war. A single electronic component, replicated millions of times, has altered the mathematics of the front. If this data impresses you, comment "Logistics wins" here in the comments. Because more than a weapon, the proximity fuse was a lesson in organization, science, and long-term thinking. The circuit weighed no more than 200 grams, but its impact reverberated like tons of traditional artillery. And most fascinatingly, the sensors also knew if they were approaching the ground. On ground bombing missions, the shells exploded between the treetops or just above the trenches, hitting soldiers they thought were protected under cover. The psychological terror was immediate. It was no longer enough to hide. The enemy was in the air, in the shells, in the frequencies. It was a war conducted by tiny antennas, calibrated in silence by mathematicians who had never set foot on the front. And perhaps this is why the German generals did not understand. It wasn't just a new weapon, it was a new way of thinking about war. And that change was about to become even more visible when projectiles stopped targeting planes or soldiers and start targeting ships. Before it exploded in the enemy camp, the greatest American fear was that a proximity fuse would blow. In the wrong place, more precisely that it would not explode. The risk was not in the failure of the weapon, but in its unexploded success. The Allies' fear was clear. If a single VT-fused shell was captured intact, the Germans could decipher its engineering, replicate it, or worse, devise countermeasures that nullified its power. For this reason, for almost 2 years, this weapon was kept under the densest cloak of scientific counter-espionage of war. In 1942, when the first successful tests were conducted in the Pacific, the use of the technology was immediately restricted to the Navy and only in hard-to-reach sea zones where the chances of recovery by the enemy were nil. The orders were strict. If a ship was hit and the ammunition compartment did not explode, divers were to destroy all remaining shells. None could be left. The same directive was applied to submarines and remote bases. The risk was not military, it was epistemological. The war waged within each shell could not become visible to the enemy. In 1943, British and American scientists drafted a binational protocol entitled Prevention of Adverse Recovery. It was, in practice, a primer on the deliberate destruction of technology. Royal Navy officers received specific training to identify unexploded shells and neutralize them with secondary explosives. On ground missions, special engineering units were deployed exclusively to hunt down projectiles that had not detonated. No matter the cost, the priority was to prevent the enemy from learning. This obsession with secrecy has even postponed the use of technology on the European front. Until 1944, all proximity fuses produced were intended for Pacific or naval zones. Not even the fighting in North Africa or Italy was considered safe enough. It was a war of information containment. Churchill, in direct correspondence with Roosevelt, wrote, "We fear the day when the Reich understands what we have thrown upon them." And that day would only come when the Allies themselves judged that there was no more time for the enemy to react. The decision to allow land use in December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, was the result of desperation, but accompanied by strict damage control. After each operation, Allied units inspected the camps to collect remnants of ammunition. Daily reports were sent to the Pentagon and the War Office in London. Each unexploded projectile was treated as if it carried a nuclear secret, and there were reasons for this caution. The Office of Naval Intelligence intercepted Japanese and German communications that suggested attempts to understand the new explosion pattern. In response, the Americans further increased the variability of the circuits. The frequency of radar emission was changed in batches. The detonation time started to follow pseudo-random algorithms. It was as if the projectiles themselves were hidden within the statistics. And yet, the Allies knew one mistake was enough for the game to change. This scientific paranoia was not unfounded. It was proof of the awareness that behind every projectile he thought of was a secret he could not speak. And the ironic thing is that even after capturing some remains, the Germans still refused to believe what they saw. An Abwehr report, sent in January 1945, classified VT fuses as technically infeasible, probably propaganda devices. Not only did they not understand the technology, they denied its existence, but the world would change again. Because while the Germans despised invisible logic, the Japanese were about to face it, and there in the Pacific Theater, there would be nowhere else to hide. As the war raged at the front, thousands of women were quietly carrying out a task critical to the Allied victory. They worked in factories across the United States, far from the front lines, not knowing the real impact of the work they did. At places like the Crossley Corporation and Sylvania Electric, female workers assembled proximity fuses, essential parts that would transform the course of the war, but which for them were just another part of an industrial process. Sitting on workbenches, magnifying glasses, soldering tiny electronics into vacuum tubes, these women followed meticulous procedures, immersed in a routine that seemed bland, but actually underpinned a crucial part of modern warfare. The safety rules were strict. They couldn't talk about what they were putting together. The content of his tasks was an absolute military secret. All they knew was that they were assembling radio parts, a convenient excuse for a job that would actually help build a revolutionary weapon. Each component required absolute precision. The slightest failure in soldering a wire or fixing a circuit could result in fuse failure, and on the battlefield, that would mean the difference between life and death. The workers, some of them barely out of adolescence, were immersed in the spirit of war. There was no room for distractions. The silence was absolute. The risks were not only technical, but also safety. In the event of an accident or error, a failure in the fuse could mean a disaster, with fatal consequences not only for the Allied soldiers, but also for the workers themselves, who were responsible for parts that would detonate at the exact moment of impact, or when the proximity radar was activated. They didn't know that they were putting intelligence inside a projectile, creating an invisible field of destruction, a technology that, when activated, would become the difference between victory and defeat. Each of those vacuum tubes, which seemed so fragile and banal in his hands, possessed an undeniable potential for change. These women, invisible to official history, were at the forefront of a logistical effort that seemed like an industrial utopia. Without them, without their precision, the project would not have worked. The production data is impressive. By 1944, American factories were producing more than 70,000 proximity fuses per day. Each of them represented a small piece of a giant puzzle assembled by anonymous hands. These women, many of them mothers and wives, knew that their work contributed to the war, but they did not understand the magnitude of its importance. They were saving lives without knowing it. The work of these women, although essential, was never recognized as it should be. No medals, no titles or honors were given to them. However, without the commitment and dedication of thousands of workers, the war would have been much more difficult. They were, in fact, unseen heroines who helped turn the tide of the war. Imagine what that means. They weren't just assembling components, but they were creating a new paradigm. If a single fuse failed, lives would be lost. But they deftly ensured that accuracy was maintained, often under grueling and difficult working conditions. The story of their lives, silenced by the urgency of war, needed to be acknowledged. They played a role without which proximity fuse technology would never have had the desired impact. And so the war was won not only by generals, scientists or soldiers. It was won by those whose hands had never touched the battlefield, but who were quietly shaping the future of modern warfare. Now, the irony of history is that the Allies' best-kept secret was on every assembly line. Even the Axis powers, especially Germany, could not understand that the real advantage lay not in a new tank or plane, but in a quiet revolution, forged in silence and precision. However, this carefully guarded advantage was about to be revealed in one of the most unexpected scenarios of the war, on the battlefield, where the unseen power would begin to turn the tide. And when that happened, Germany, already losing the war, would be even more astonished to realize that the real weapon was in something they couldn't even see. The Third Reich, with all its ostentation of military power, brilliant scientists, and abundant resources, failed to create a weapon that seemed within reach of its technical capability: the proximity fuse. The reason for this failure lies not only in technological limitations or in the resources available, but in a much deeper and systemic failure within the regime itself. What the Germans failed to realize is that the secret behind American success was actually in the way innovation was approached and managed. While the United States became an example of democratic cooperation between science, industry, and government, Germany, under the Nazi regime, lived hostage to an authoritarian and fragmented structure, which limited true innovation. To understand the contrast, one must look at the structure that limited innovation in the German war system. Firstly, the leadership model of the Third Reich was based on absolute control, where decisions were centralized and emanated from a single authority figure, Adolf Hitler, and his closest subordinates. This, in itself, created an environment where the free exchange of ideas was discouraged. While American universities teamed up with industry and the military to solve problems, such as the development of the proximity fuse, German scientists and engineers were immersed in a constant power struggle. They competed with each other, often without collaboration between departments, as the regime preferred to work with a rigid and competitive hierarchical system where personal success was tied to favoring faction leaders and research groups, rather than collective technical innovation. For example, the Luftwaffe had its own research division, separate from the investigations done by Army and Navy scientists. Each of these divisions had its own projects, and in many cases, innovation efforts were disorganized, with projects not shared between departments. Meanwhile, in America, scientists, engineers, and military personnel shared discoveries, moved forward with joint projects, and tackled problems as an integrated team. Research for the proximity fuse began in the United Kingdom, but its transformation into reality was made possible by open collaboration with the United States, which in turn possessed the industrial base and collaborative spirit necessary to make this invention thrive. Not only were American scientists and military united in the mission to win the war, but the American system of universities, industry, and the military working together proved essential in turning a theoretical concept into a practical, large-scale reality. This collective mindset of collaboration is what allowed the United States to overcome the technical challenges of creating the proximity fuse. What the Nazis lacked with their centralized and competitive structure was precisely the ability to pool their forces to achieve a common goal. Even with the talents of scientists like Werner Heisenberg, the Nazis could not turn their discoveries into practical applications. The research effort was not shared effectively, and any major development was in many cases attributed to a small circle of loyalty within the regime, rather than being recognized as a collective achievement. The result was a fragmented system, where any relevant innovation was stifled by a lack of cooperation, seriously undermining the possibility of revolutionary breakthroughs. To the Germans, the concept of the proximity fuse seemed like science fiction at first. When they had access to some specimens captured during the war, their first reaction was incredulity. Hitler's regime, with its strong belief in total war based on mass destruction, was not prepared to accept that a simple artillery shell could be more effective than brute force. Even after analyzing proximity fuse projectiles, many German scientists and engineers simply couldn't believe that this new technology was possible. They were stuck in the mentality of their own ideological rigidity. The fuse, with its delicate vacuum tubes and its extreme sensitivity, seemed unfeasible within the parameters of mass production of the Nazi regime. They ignored the data, dismissed the possibilities, and focused on traditional forms of warfare, unable to see innovation before them. The real historical irony lies in the total blindness of Nazi scientists, who did not even consider that the future of war could lie in something as small and precise as a projectile with a miniaturized radar. They were so focused on massive innovations, missiles, tanks, airplanes, that they couldn't see that the real advantage lay in the small technological revolution. Germany, with its fragmented and authoritarian military and industrial structure, was unable to keep up with the speed and adaptability of the United States, whose factories and creative minds were fully mobilized to respond to the challenges of war. This explains, in part, why the German production system failed to stand up to American industrial power. Although the Nazis possessed enormous research and development capacity, their fragmented approach simply did not allow for the large-scale production of innovations, which left them at a disadvantage. It was not just a question of resources or technical competence. It was the lack of a cooperative structure that resulted in the ineffectiveness of the German war. When it came to innovation, the Allies were one step ahead, not because they were more powerful or wealthier, but because they were able to unite their efforts into an unbeatable force of research, production, and execution. What became clear from the German failure was that the secret of the war was not just in the weapons, but in the way these weapons were conceived, produced, and implemented. The real advantage lay in freedom of thought and collaboration between different sectors of society, something that totalitarian regimes simply could not replicate. History has shown that democracy, far from being an obstacle to efficiency, was the true source of the innovation that changed the course of warfare. Meanwhile, the Germans continued their frantic search, obsessed with control and competition, while the Allies used cooperation as their greatest weapon. With this fundamental imbalance in mind, the story of how the proximity fuse became the most effective weapon of war continues to unfold, revealing more layers of a technology that to the Nazis seemed impossible. But as we will see in the next part, the impact of this innovation was not limited to a single battle. It would transform the course of war campaigns, proving once again that in war, the real power lies not only in those who have the strength, but in those who have the vision. The proximity fuse wasn't just a technological breakthrough, it was the tipping point that forever transformed the nature of modern warfare. For the first time, artillery ceased to be a simple means of firing projectiles. It has become a form of intelligence, a tool capable of making decisions in real time. What was once a passive fire and wait process now transformed artillery into an active response system, which anticipated the threat and reacted accurately, all without the need for direct human intervention. The impact of this change cannot be underestimated. War, until then, was dominated by brute force, the number of projectiles fired, and the resistance of war machines. The focus was on firepower, on the mass of metal capable of sweeping a battlefield. But with the proximity fuse, that concept has been subverted. Firing a projectile now depended on a dynamic and intelligent process. The projectile was no longer just an object of destruction, but a device with a brain, a sensor that made decisions in milliseconds to ensure impact on the target. He already knew the exact moment to detonate, not by direct impact, but by detecting the presence of the enemy in the air. This small technological revolution radically changed the way the military thought about its weapons. A projectile was no longer just a piece of metal thrown at random to hit a target. It became an active part of a clever strategy. Each shot was now an advanced calculation operation, a hands-on experiment in how technology could act almost autonomously, guided only by the physics and mathematics that define battlefields. It is no exaggeration to say that the proximity fuse was the embryo of a new era of war, in which the line between man and machine, between action and reaction, began to disappear. Digital warfare was still decades away, but the fundamental principle was there, in the efficiency of the smart projectile. Warfare as an equation, where variables and algorithms replaced simple brute force. The psychological impact on the troops was immediate. The transition from a resistance model of warfare, where soldiers depended on human courage, to a precision model, where mathematics and technology became the protagonists, was a quiet but profound historical transformation. Not only did the physical capabilities of the weapons increase, but their autonomy expanded unexpectedly. The battlefield was now populated by equipment that thought on its own, which reacted without the direct intervention of the operator. This change would be a key foundation for future generations of smart weapons and autonomous systems. It was not only the way the war was fought that changed, but the very premises of how the armed forces thought about war. The German view of brute force, the powerful tanks and bombers, was eclipsed by American technological effectiveness. The weapons designs that the Nazis believed were the future of warfare were falling out of favor, while the Allies were at the forefront, creating the future with each new shot. The paradigm shift was complete, and the most ironic thing of all is that even when Germany had access to proximity fuses, Nazi officials refused to believe that such sophisticated technology could have been developed by their enemies. They saw what appeared to be simple little devices, without imagining the revolution that these devices represented. For them, the future of war lay in the great machines of destruction: tanks, planes, and missiles. The idea of a weapon that thought on its own seemed impossible, especially in a military production system that refused to accept the new. As we saw earlier, while Germany was immersed in its own internal disputes and ideological limitations, the United States was making history by building a new way of fighting. Each projectile fired represented not only a tactical breakthrough, but the evolution of a military philosophy that embraced innovation and cooperation. The battle the Allies were waging was not just against an enemy army, but against an obsolete mindset that could not adapt to the ongoing technological revolution. And this revolution was just beginning. The proximity fuse, by becoming the model of more effective weapons, demonstrated that the battlefield of the future would no longer depend only on who had the most strength or the most resources. It would be defined by the ability to use intelligence, not just human, but machine, to make faster, more effective strategic decisions. This was the new kind of warfare that was emerging, and the Allies were at the forefront of this transformation. But as the Americans cemented this technical victory, what was yet to come was another test of their ability to scale these innovations seamlessly and efficiently. As we will see in the next part, this technological revolution was not limited to a single theater of operations, but was about to change the face of global conflict in an unexpected way. After the war, the proximity fuse, despite its enormous contribution, remained an invisible weapon, hidden in the shadows of military history. While planes, tanks, and even nuclear weapons have come to be celebrated as the icons of victory, the proximity fuse has never become a symbol of triumph. It was quiet, unobtrusive, and effective, its impactful actions in combat often unknown to the general public. Their contribution was decisive, but at the same time, the Allies themselves preferred not to focus on the technology that somehow seemed to be a background weapon. Most of the history of World War II was told with the focus on the great battles and the weapons that caused the most visible damage. But the proximity fuse was different. It didn't destroy cities or shoot down planes directly, but it did prevent greater destruction by accurately eliminating targets before they even touched the ground. The technology didn't make a thunderous noise, but it had a lasting impact. However, the real paradox lies in the fact that the more effective the innovations, the more they tend to disappear from the spotlight of history. The proximity fuse was not only shrouded in the silence of its effectiveness, but also in the secrecy in which it was kept during the war. It was a weapon that was not to be shared or even discussed in public. Its lack of notoriety after the conflict is, in a sense, an irony, a weapon of such importance that it never received the glory it deserved. In addition, there was a moral ambiguity associated with it. Unlike direct battles and attacks with weapons of mass destruction, the proximity fuse was an impersonal, invisible, and lethal technology at a distance. He did his job without the enemies knowing what had hit them until it was too late. And so often, the true story of his contribution has been hidden, overshadowed by the narrative of more spectacular but less effective achievements. However, it's time to give this weapon the justice it deserves. The proximity fuse didn't want glory. It was not on display in squares and museums. But silently and without ostentation, it was one of the elements that in fact helped to ensure the victory of the Allies. By focusing on their tangible victories, the winning powers ignored the impact of the invisible. And while tanks, planes, and battles became the protagonists of the history of war, the proximity fuse, a small invention but with a big impact, remained on the fringes of the official narrative. The history of its importance remains one of historical injustices that have yet to be repaired. In doing so, we can understand more deeply the true magnitude of how a small technological advance altered the course of a global conflict, and how it remained silent, like war itself, without ever receiving the recognition it deserved. The real question is, why has almost no one heard of this weapon if it has been so decisive for so many victories? What does the silence that followed the war reveal about the way we deal with decisive innovations? And more importantly, what role does invisible technology play in the history of great wars? This brings us to an even more intriguing revelation. By the end of this journey, an even more perplexing truth will become clear. The real power that emerged from American intelligence was not brute force imposed on enemies, but the pinpoint precision of a concept that challenged conventional notions of war. The proximity fuse did not arise from the battlefields or the offices of generals. It was born from laboratories and minds that questioned the status quo, that saw war not as a test of endurance, but as a problem to be solved. What made this device the most effective weapon was not its ability to destroy or damage, but its quiet genius. While other countries clung to the physical power, numbers, and brutality of their armies, the United States bet on the ability of its scientists to reimagine war, to think beyond traditional solutions. The proximity fuse, at its core, was the response of a nation that knew that war did not have to be defined solely by who had the greatest number of tanks or planes. The real power lay in the ability to unite free brains, to integrate technology, science, and innovation into the war effort. At a time of global uncertainty, it was intelligence and collaboration between different spheres of society that transformed the battle for military supremacy. While Germany's totalitarian regime weakened with its internal divisions and the limited vision of its command, the United States embraced a model where healthy competition and the free exchange of ideas created solutions that changed the course of history. In the end, what led the United States to victory was not the strength of its weapons, but the strength of its ideas. The proximity fuse symbolizes this victory as a metaphor for a power that won not by brutality, but by intelligence. When the human mind thinks more effectively than fear and direct confrontation, war transforms from a physical battlefield to a game of reasoning, a war of minds, where what really matters is who can see beyond the limitations of the present and anticipate the future accurately. This is what has made the United States a leader, not only in terms of industrial capacity, but in terms of adaptation and innovation. But what happened when this technology was exposed to the world? What really happened when the Germans finally came across the power of this invention? The answer, and the surprise it brought with it, will take us to a pivotal moment in history. The German ideological and military collapse was not, as many might imagine, a defeat by failures of weapons or troops, but by the inability to adapt to an invisible and silent innovation. The Allies, with their impressive industrial prowess and an integrated approach between science, industry and strategy, defeated what the Germans considered invincible. The proximity fuse, an invention that many Nazis considered a propaganda trick, became the key to American military effectiveness, not only for its accuracy, but for the way it redefined warfare. The Germans were stuck with their traditional doctrines, and while their weapons and strategies continued to fail, the Allies quietly knew how technology could turn the tide. Victory was not just a matter of who had more soldiers or tanks, but who possessed the ability to think faster, to explore new technological frontiers before anyone else. The great lesson drawn from this journey is clear and universal. In war, as in life, logistics and intelligence trump brutality. Volume doesn't beat tactics, but the ability to generate more ideas, to integrate more practical and creative solutions, is what really defines who will win. Modern warfare has become an equation in which brute force was no longer the determining factor. Whoever could use technology to think faster and act more accurately definitely had the upper hand. The future of battles would not be defined solely by the force of arms, but by the ability to anticipate and control war in ways that no one had previously imagined. We were defeated by trucks. A German officer's phrase encapsulates all the irony of this story. They lost not because of a tactical error, but because of the underestimation of a nation that thought beyond the conventional and used its industry as a silent weapon. The same force that won on the battlefield was invisible to the eyes of the enemy, and it was precisely this invisibility that gave them the upper hand. If you appreciate stories like this that retell the true story behind the big wins, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to support our research and search for historical truth. Comment below what was the most shocking data you discovered in this video, and of course, activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another amazing story.